This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This Sunday, much of the world will celebrate May Day, International Workers' Day, amidst a wave of union organizing in the United States that includes scores of Starbucks stores and the newly formed Amazon labor union. We end today's show with a film that tells the story of the first union for all workers. The Wobblies is a documentary that came out in 1979 and has just been restored and entered into the Library of Congress's National Film Registry.
What's your name?
Sam Scarlett.
What's your religion?
The IWW.
That ain't no religion.
The only one I got.
Are you a citizen? No, I'm an industrial worker of the world.
The one who is a working man could not be denied membership for any reason, as long as he was an actual wage worker, race, creed, color, for any
Sex.
reason, sex, whatever.
Industrial workers of the world, work, good wages, and respect. That's what they wanted for the workers. To be people, not nobody.
In the grain fields, we harvested every major grain that grew in North America. Wheat, oats, barley, rye.
The heat was 110 to 112 to 114 degrees temperature out in the sun, and you could look across the plains and see a freight train from miles away.
There's power in the land of working men when they stand hand in hand. That's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union.
The Wobblies, featuring oral histories with elderly former members of the IWW who were in their 80s and 90s in the 1970s. It's narrated by the late Roger Baldwin, one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, who died in 1981. This is another clip.
But unskilled labor had almost no representation whatever. AFL didn't take in unskilled workers, and they had no voice to speak for them. It was these conditions that were largely responsible for the founding of the industrial workers of the world.
The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the earth and the machinery of production, and abolish the wage system.
I remember reading of the founding convention of the industrial workers of the world, which took place in Chicago in 1905, and headed by men who were already well known to newspaper readers. Big Bill Haywood, for instance, of the Western Federation of Miners, and Eugene V. Debs, candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, and Mother Jones, and many others.
Fellow workers, this is the Continental Congress of the working class. I don't give a snap of my fingers whether skilled workers join this union or not. We don't need them. There are 35 million workers in this country that aren't organized yet. What we want to establish at this time is an organization that will open wide its doors to every man or woman that earns his livelihood by brain or muscle.
The words of IWW leader Big Bill Haywood in the film The Wobblies. For more, we're joined by the Academy Award-winning filmmaker Deborah Shaffer, who co-directed this remarkable documentary with Stewart Bird in 1979. It's just been restored and screens nationwide on May Day, this Sunday, online at the end of May. Deborah, welcome to Democracy Now! It's an astounding film. Tell us the story of The Wobblies.
Well, the Wobblies themselves was a union, as you heard in the clip. It was founded in 1905 out of necessity, really. There were the workers at that time, unskilled workers, had no unions. There was no such thing. The AFL existed, but they only admitted and organized skilled workers, mostly white, mostly male, bricklayers, masons, people with highly skilled jobs. So the masses of industrial workers, remember this was the early days of industrialization in the United States. The textile mills were booming, the lumber mills were booming, the cotton gins were booming. The workers had no representation at all, and they were being expected to work 7 days a week, 12-hour days, no breaks, no meals, underpaid, overworked. Children were working. Conditions were terrible and intolerable.
I wanted to go back to your film. In this clip, we hear from Black longshoreman James Fair after, one of the founders of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin.
In the ports of the Atlantic and of the Gulf Coast, black and white workers were organized in the same unions, which the AFL and the established unions did not permit.
Well, we were on the farm, and conditions were just bad. My parents heard of Pennsylvania, and so to speak, where you could rake up money out of the street, and they decided, to come north. Getting jobs as far as the Negroes or black is concerned was pretty rough. And the IWW was the only thing that was accepting Negro or black workers, without, freely. We had Fletcher, he was a Negro, and we had one Neff. He was white, but he was a very dedicated union man, both of these men. We would have our pep talks and whatnot, and Fletcher, after he make a speech or something or other, solidarity, all for one and one for all. We were given the roughest jobs, of course. They would have a rough job even on deck. And if a white came along, why, I didn't have no job. I'd had to go back to something else. The work was so rough, we had to use hand trucks, and two men would load that truck, freight. We'd have to truck it over very rough floors to the side of the ship to be loaded. We worked 10 hours. People were getting hurt, one after another. Just going to the hospital, we had no medical safety rules or anything like that. When the contract ran out, we'd go in for a contract, nothing doing. We had to go out on strike. And the results of that, while we were on strike, people were transported from different parts of the country to break strikes. Some would be having, guns as same as they were the law, and they would be these vans going down. They would be escorted by police escorts on motorcycles. And a striker would have as much chance before the strike breakers as a rabbit would have before a gunner.
Black longshoreman James Fair. I want to go to another clip of the Wobblies. The IWW was creative with its tactics. In this clip, we hear from migratory workers Joe Murphy and Jack Miller.
Another one of the IWW tactics was sabotage, which was anything from slowing down on the job to threatening violence, which they didn't practice as a matter of fact, but it certainly scared employers into thinking they did.
If Freedom's road seems rough and hard and strewn with rocks and thorns, just put your wooden shoes on pard, then you won't hurt your corns. To organize and teach, no doubt, is very good, that's true, but still you cannot get along without the good old wooden shoe. The wooden shoe is a symbol of the sabbat. The sabbat was the French, and the French worker, when he wanted to rest, he'd throw his sabbat in the machinery and would break it down, and that's where the word sabotage came from.
Now, if you want to know what sabotage really means, it don't mean, as the French used the word, sabot, throw a wooden shoe into the machine. Nor did it mean burning down sawmills. For what is the reason? What would be the sense in burning down your source of employment?
What did sabotage mean?
The conscious withdrawal of efficiency.
I mean, that's another clip from the Wobblies. It is amazing, Deborah Shaffer, that you found these workers now in their, at the time, now many of them are dead, of course, in their 80s and 90s, had a hard time finding coal miners, right, because they were mostly all dead.
Yeah, I think our most, finding James Fair, the longshoreman from Philadelphia, was our most challenging. Remember, we made this film in the late 70s. There was no internet. We couldn't put out a call through social media. We actually created a leaflet that we had people hand out on the docks in Philadelphia, a physical, like color-printed paper leaflet saying, "Was your grandfather a wobbly?" Because we knew that there had to be still Black workers living in Chicago and Philadelphia who had been part of the union. And we eventually found James through, I think, a church that he was a member of, a minister knew, and led us to him. And so the search for the people was, we weren't sure when we started how many people we would find. We knew we had a few in the area around New York, and we just didn't know if we'd find, 10 or 20 still alive. I mean, in 1977, the union had been founded in 1905. So we were, people, as you said, were already very elderly. They're all gone. Everybody.
I want to go back to another clip. I mean, this film is so good. The archival footage is unbelievable as well. In this clip, it's, 1917, and World War I had begun. We hear from Roger Baldwin, the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, and narrator of this, and Wobblies, Jack Miller, Nils Pedersen, and Tom Scribner. It begins with the words of then American Federation of Labor President Sam Gompers.
This is the people's war, labor's war. The final outcome will be determined in the factories, the shops, the mines, the farms, the production and transportation agencies of the various countries. The workers have a part in this war equal with our fighting boys.
The American Federation of Labor, which of course was the established union and very patriotic, and engaged in an agreement with the government not to strike during war. The IWW would not subscribe to that. War production required immense quantities of timber, and the IWW really controlled the great timber areas of the Northwest, therefore attracting the government's attention, particularly when the IWW engaged in strikes against the conditions under which logging was done.
The general strike developed in the summer of 1917, and it spread up and down the Pacific coast. And it was led by the IWW.
In the summer of 1917, the woods were almost solidly organized. The lumberjack, the most individualistic worker that you can think of, the big man idea, Paul Bunyan complex. Now the solidarity was such. Not one logger remained in the camps wherever we could get in communication with that camp to tell them that the strike was on.
50,000 lumberjacks, 50,000 packs, 50,000 dirty rolls of blankets on their backs, 50,000 minds made up to strike and strike like men. For 50 years they packed a bed, but never will again.
They tried every way to break up the strike. They sent soldiers in there. Soldiers that never had an axe in their hand. They didn't know they get lost if they walked around a big stump.
They organized the spruce division. That's the way they used the army as strike breakers.
They called them the Loyal Legion of Loggers. We called them the lousy, long-legged loggers. Wave the flag with one hand and rob you with the other.
Another clip of the Wobblies. The director, Deborah Shaffer, is with us. There's so much to talk about, but if you could talk about what happened to them in World War I, the Palmer raids, and their relationship with the more establishment AFL.
Well, the AFL wanted absolutely nothing to do with the IWW, of course. They saw them as a threat, although I have to say that later, to skip over to the end of it, what you're asking me about, the IWW really was the precursor to the CIO. Many, many IWW organizers went on to become organizers for the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Unions, which did represent unskilled workers, and that was organized in the 30s. The Wobblies were put out of business by the federal government. There's just no other way to put it. I learned how, in the process of making the film, how really deep and dreadful the repression from the government was. Similar to, like, lately we've seen there was a film a couple of years ago about the murder of Fred Hampton, which had been organized by the FBI. And this was a very similar attack on the IWW, organized by, you mentioned A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the time. His eager beaver young assistant was J. Edgar Hoover. And they arrested people right and left. They deported any immigrant workers, anybody who didn't have their citizenship papers, were just put on boats and deported out of the U.S., never to be allowed to return. 101 members and mostly leadership people all across the country were arrested in 1917 during the war. They were arrested and charged with sedition, put in jail. In the end, it was a sham trial, and
we have 15 seconds.
They were charged. They were given 20 years in prison for having organized the IWW. I just want to say I find, shockingly, the film is more relevant now than it was when we released it in '79.
And it's being put into the Library of Congress's National Film Registry, which is incredible, soon to be available to everyone, opening on May Day.